Hey everybody, welcome to the Fire It Up with CJ show. Today we're going to be talking about boundaries, and we're talking to Sarri Gilman about transforming your boundaries. So, welcome, Sarri.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so you're coming to Seattle to the East West Bookstore next weekend on January 12th and 13th, talking about boundaries.
Yes, I'm really excited to be there. Friday night will be a book talk,
Mm-hmm.
and Saturday is going to be a workshop on understanding your boundary life lessons.
Oh, boundary life lessons. That's interesting. So you take it into kind of a soul lesson type of thing. So your boundaries are usually something that your soul wants you to learn about what? About.
Well, it's a process of understanding your yes and no
Mm-hmm.
and understanding how you relate to other people and how we can relate in a way that's very respectful of ourselves and others.
Mm-hmm.
And also can ultimately lead to the irony of boundaries is the better you are at these, the closer you feel to people.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's kind of
Yeah,
ironic, isn't it?
I do think that that's true. I'm thinking back, like, do I believe that's a true statement? And I actually do think that that's true. You have to have
Oh,
sometimes have hard conversations but then those hard conversations create more closeness with another person.
yes,
That's interesting.
yes.
Okay, so you talk about various steps in setting boundaries, and well, first of all, let's talk about basics. What are boundaries for people who are new to this term? And how do I know if I have good boundaries or not? Excuse me.
So boundaries are really just your yes and your no inside. It's just simply how you say yes and how you say no. And I like to think of it and keep it very, very simple that you have a compass inside of you and that compass tells you when you tune in if something is really a yes for you or a no for you. And we often end up arguing with that compass inside. Sometimes we don't like the answers that we hear,
Right.
and sometimes we don't like the answers that we hear from others
Mm-hmm.
about their boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
So the process of doing boundary work allows us to really go deep inside, listen, and what we end up hearing is our wisdom.
Mm. So when we have boundaries, it's that we've listened. So let's say I have one where I've been thinking, oh, should I go to this class or not? And there's a part of me that's like, well, yeah, there's something I really like about this person, but no, there's something that's a little bit off. And so I've been tuning into my inside guidance, and then the boundary would be saying no. Like I tuned in, and in the end, it was like yes and no, but mostly no. So I thought, okay, so my answer is no. So now someone says, would you like to go to that class? And my best friend says, do you want to go to that class? And I have an inner no. So my boundary would be saying, no, thanks so much for thinking about me and asking me to go to this class with you. I so much would like to spend time with you, but I thought about it and there's
Right, but
something
that
going
you've
on.
tuned in and
Yeah, so that's what a
yes,
boundary looks
sorry.
like.
Got it. Yes, it's that tuning in, it's that awareness, and it can be a little bit confusing because sometimes people do hear a yes and a no at the same time, and they're
Right.
like, "Well, which one? How do I know which
Right.
one it really is?"
Right.
And then you have to. That means you have to sit with it longer and get to what is it really for me? Because sometimes we're saying yes for other people, and we're saying yes for reasons that might not really serve what we're needing. And we have to really think deeply about, well, what is that yes about? And what is that no about? And
Mhm.
then really come to what's our real wisdom about this?
Mhm.
Because, as a therapist, that's really where this work has grown from. I've worked in therapy for 32 years,
Mhm.
and I've also run nonprofits for 20 years and did
Right.
leadership development for 7 years. So I've done a lot of people work.
Right.
And my conclusion is that most people are struggling with their boundaries
Mhm. Mhm.
and that most of our issues are around our boundaries. And the only way that I can sit with a total stranger and help them is I'm tuning into their compass. I'm just
Mm,
listening for what's their yes and what's their no. What are they struggling with? Because otherwise, I would have no idea how to help anybody. I'm
mm-hmm,
just really listening and going, oh, I hear the struggle in the compass and I hear what their compass is saying. And sometimes it takes a while for us to learn to trust our
mm-hmm.
own yes and our own no.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what you said in the very beginning, someone who says I have good boundaries, it means that this person is not feeling out of balance because they're in, I think it's probably like if their inner alignment is true to what they're saying outwardly to other people, they would be in imbalance, distraught over someone else, exhausted inside, or in some way out of sorts. It means that when you feel like I have good boundaries, it means that you are in balance, not distraught with someone else, not exhausted inside, and not feeling out of sorts. Is that
That,
true?
that's right. That
Okay.
there's a level of exhaustion that comes to us
Mm-hmm.
when we're out of sync with our boundaries and our
Mm-hmm.
own wisdom, and we're not able to pay attention or listen to it, or we may not be able to follow our own boundaries. You may be in a culture where there's a lot of oppression happening, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so it's not easy to come by that feeling of good boundaries. And I don't think of them as having good boundaries or bad boundaries. I think of them as everybody has a yes and no inside,
Mm-hmm.
no matter
Mm-hmm.
where you're from, no matter where you're born, and staying connected to that and being in tune with that and being in a culture where it's safe for you to follow that is really, your ability to live a good life and to be able to have wisdom and follow your own tuning. But even if you're doing well with being tuned in and doing great with your self care in your life and you feel in balance, it doesnn't mean that 10 days from now you'll still feel that way. You know, it's pretty easy for us to get thrown off kilter.
Right.
And so I don't like to think of it as you have good boundaries or bad boundaries because it's very situational. It's a practice. It's something that we work at every day.
Mm-hmm.
And some days are better than others.
Right. It's funny that you say that because one of the things that I enjoyed when you said, like, hey, I'm still working on my boundaries. We will be working on our boundaries forever. Like, this is not just like I have good boundaries now. Like, there may be some big thing that you needed to get boundaries with, like a person or a situation, but it's a lifelong endeavor. And when I read that, I just laughed because I thought that is so true. And I never thought of it that way, but it's absolutely true because I've worked very hard to be a person with good boundaries, but there's always situations like I've been working on myself, it seems like forever. And there's always times when you actually have to think about where you have an inner yes, but you're actually saying no to that inner yes and what you're doing. So there are
You
tons and tons
earn
of
it.
times.
You absolutely earn
You
those
you
good
definitely,
boundaries.
you definitely,
And
I
they're
love,
hard-won life lessons, and they're very hard won. And then the next challenge comes along, and sometimes we see ourselves entering a situation. I was teaching a webinar this morning. Every month I teach a webinar on boundaries on a different topic, and this morning was on messy situations.
hmm,
And that is when, you can enter a situation with great boundaries, but you may be surrounded by a whole group of people that have really messy boundaries.
hmm,
And you're in a big, messy situation. And you have to use a real different boundary skill set to navigate across those kinds of situations. And so there's kind of what I see as a boundary expertise that begins to be developed in people that are really staying aware and thinking of it as a practice. They're not arriving at some destination point as good boundaries. They're arriving at a destination point of I pay attention to this every day.
hmm,
That's the arrival point. I pay attention to the questions people ask me.
hmm,
I pay attention to the kind of boundaries that people have that interact with me. I
hmm,
pay attention to this and I notice, like, how is this person interacting with me and how do the boundaries feel and what kind of boundaries are needed? What kind of understanding and agreements do we have to make? I'm sure you experience this when you make an agreement to schedule with somebody. The expectation is they would be on time, right,
hmm,
CJ?
hmm,
And what happens when people can't maintain that?
hmm.
and how
Mm-hmm.
it affects you and your ability to work with them. So I look at every agreement, every interaction with a person. I am studying them and I'm thinking about how are they doing with their boundaries? How will
Mm-hmm.
it be to interact with them?
Mm-hmm. It's when you were talking about the webinar that you're teaching today, I was thinking about a group that I've been working with, and in this case, it's a cultural thing. I will not name the name of the company, but this company is a company that is very sales focused. And when
Hmm.
you're in sales focus, it's very much about responding. Like, oh, client wants this. Okay, hang up the phone, do what the client wants. Client wants that. Go and do that, whatever. So that particular modality is great if you're in sales, but at one point you have to move beyond that. And that modality of like constantly letting someone interrupt you, responding and doing something doesn't work because you have no time to think about planning the long term future of your company. And so, what I've noticed about this group is that everyone in the group has this kind of emergency level thing, which is great. Great when that's the primary responsibility that you have, but then there's never a time to stop and think, like, am I even responding? Like, is there a quicker way that I can be doing this instead of actually doing this? Could I just put up a web page and answer the same question that I get 100 times a day and point people to the website and train people how to get information on the website? Or would I prefer doing this emergency thing? And it's interesting because it's a cultural thing that's part of this company. So I don't really know how to resolve it because even if you are a person who recognizes there's a boundary issue with, client calls, I'm going to respond quickly because I have no boundary. It's hard
That's
because
right,
everyone
because there,
around you is doing the same thing.
that's right. And that also happens in industries like healthcare.
Yes,
It
absolutely.
happens in hospitality industries where you work in a hotel and it's all about service.
Yeah.
And what happens, the cost of these kinds of environments is that people feel very worn out on their ability to take care of themselves because they're really in a job all day where it feels like they're not allowed to have boundaries. And even if they are like in education where teachers are allowed to have a lunch break, you'll find that a lot of them won't take a lunch break because they're serving kids that need help with homework during their lunchtime. And the same thing happens in hospitality and in healthcare and in probably the place that
Sales
you
too.
were
Yeah.
describing,
Yeah.
right? Like there are sometimes when people don't even feel like they can take a bathroom break.
Right.
And what really suffers, you've identified one thing is that it can get pretty inefficient with time usage
Mm-hmm.
after a while. Absolutely. But the other is that it really drains people in their self care.
Mm-hmm.
And they go home so exhausted and beat up from this. There is no way they can make up for it when they go home. And so
Mm.
the message that we send these people is, do their self care and do it on the weekends or do it on their off time or refill your tank. But if we drain them dry all day on the job and self care is not happening all throughout your day, you can't refill later.
Mm.
And then we say they get burned out and we blame you. Like you're burned out, you're
Right.
now drained dry. You didn't do enough self care, but really, we didn't set it up so that you could even do basic self care through the day so that your job makes sense to you.
So I'm wondering though, because sometimes, so I think that that's definitely true. This organization, which has this culture that's endemic to, they have like meditation rooms. So they
Mhm.
actually have all these things that
That look
recognize,
like it.
yeah, that recognize that there's a
Uh-huh.
problem, but
Uh-huh.
yet they, right? Like they're like, oh, let's actually meditate. And then that's like, I don't have enough time to meditate. So they actually recognize these things, but they don't necessarily, I think, follow through on those things. So, is it possible that some people just have personalities that even when you do give them resources, you tell them to take self care, they don't do it? And
Well, boundaries and self care are completely related.
mhm,
So this is a system that is completely connected to each other.
mhm,
And the problem is that people think of self-care as a separate activity where you're going to meditation, you're doing yoga, you're taking time out, doing a bubble bath, but you're not associating your self-care with your boundary kind of issues, with the places where you live in your pattern all the time.
Oh,
And you
like yeah, on
have
a
to,
daily basis. I see you're not
right, you
taking
have
it
to
out.
tie your self-care exactly to your pattern. And in my book, I've outlined 7 patterns for people
Mm-hmm.
so they can figure out, what pattern am I using? Like,
Mm-hmm.
my pattern, my personal pattern has been workaholic. I'm
Mm-hmm. Me
so
too.
so you know, if I don't address, if my self-care is not about my workaholism, then the self-care is nice, but it actually doesn't help me where I need the boundaries.
And just for
I
folks, yeah. So for folks who are not familiar with it, so there are 7 different modalities: are workaholic, sacrificer, caretaker, and then what are the other ones? The other 4?
So there's number,
Uh huh.
somebody who numbs out a lot, and there's the lover pattern, where that's where you love and love and love others and you wonder why you never feel loved in return.
Okay.
And then there's the protector. So I think
Okay.
workaholic and caretaker are pretty easy to
Right.
understand. Like, you know one. If you are one, you know that.
Right. Or a caretaker, or someone who's like, oh, I need to take care of you and take care. Like, do you need another blanket? Like that kind of thing.
Well, and there's also real caretaking, where some of your listeners are in places in their lives where there really are people depending on them
Right.
that they have to take care
Right.
of,
Kids or
right?
elder care. Yep.
Right, and it's not optional, or somebody in the family is sick, but what happens is we don't take care of ourselves. The more and more we caretake other people, the more we keep filling our lives up with doing as much as we can for others. Self-care tends to go really, really low for those people, and they
Mm-hmm.
end up feeling like they have no boundaries in their life, and
Mm-hmm.
they can't discern anymore when to ask for help, if somebody else can step in for a little bit so they can take a break, so they can lose sight of that with all the
Mm-hmm.
caretaking.
Yep.
Very common. So I like our boundaries to be tied to these patterns, because
Okay.
let's go back to the caretaker for a
Okay.
moment. Um, if the caretaker is just focusing on taking bubble baths, but they're not focusing on how many people are they trying to take care of, and how much help do they need, and where do they need boundaries, and I can't take on one more thing right now because I've got so much on my plate. If they're not adjusting and dealing with that pattern,
Mm-hmm.
all the boundary skills in the world don't make a difference. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
help. It doesn't help us.
Mm-hmm.
We have to understand these patterns that we use. That's why I spent all that time in the book on them. We have to understand these patterns, figure out which one we're relying on, and then work on our boundaries and our self-care there. So, for example, I'm talking with you right now, right? We're working.
Mm-hmm.
So like I said, I taught a webinar this morning, and now I'm doing an interview with you. So I have some self-care time this afternoon where there's no work this afternoon. I
Oh,
won't be
nice.
talking to people. I won't be listening. I'm going to be, doing
So
something
you
where I
built it into your
stop.
schedule because you're like, I'm outward facing. I have to be on this webinar. I have to be on with CJ. So,
And I love
yeah,
doing that. But I
right,
also know that I have to create stop points. I shouldn't hang up with you, for example, and then go see a client,
right,
because that will just be too much layering into my day.
right,
So I've set up my day, because I'm a workaholic. I look at my schedule carefully, and my way of taking care of myself, I'd say I'm a recovered workaholic, is that I look at my schedule carefully now and I say, okay, where are my boundaries in my day? Where are my boundaries of what I'm asking of myself? And that is self-care.
mm-hmm. Right. So doing it in context and actually building it in self-care into your work day so that that's actually a priority.
Right. So when you talked about the place of work where everybody's just going on response mode all day to everything, and they're amping up and they're rushing so much, they can't slow down and meditate, because that would make no sense, right?
Right,
The whole job is just, getting them to be so
right,
responsive and so quick, they can't slow down. So the thing is, how do they then get a time to stop responding to people, begin to come down, and then do meditation? So
right.
there's a stop point earlier to start slowing down. Now it's your turn. So now you get in hour 3, you start slowing down. You're not responding to everything because now we're getting you on slower down so that you can go meditate, because you can't ask somebody to go, 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 go and not get to slow down at all.
Okay, so I'm going to be a workaholic because I am, and you know this place too. So I'm anticipating this group saying, "Well, if I do that, I can't even stop for an hour. I could. I would love to actually put an hour on my calendar to do that, to slow down and then to go to that meditation room. But if I do that, I'm just going to screw myself the next day because there's going to be so much stuff that I have to do that I have to make up for that hour that I kind of took meditating." Okay,
Right. And
so
that's called leadership. That's called what kind of leadership is around these people, and
right.
how are leaders modeling what they want to see happen in the
Right,
workplace.
the leaders do exactly the same thing in this group. It's a whole cultural
I
thing.
know.
So,
I know, and I haven't even met the group.
right.
I know that
Oh, you're
because,
saying like the leaders need to role model that they're doing this
yes, that's
themselves.
how they get others to do it, is
Oh, I see.
leaders role model, and then people go, oh,
It's
you're
okay.
role modeling, right? And then they get their permission. So when the leadership stops and takes lunch, and leadership says, this is how we're doing this. I know you get a lot of anxiety about what the expectations are. We're going to change those expectations so that you're not feeling all that burden, because that's not realistic. And we don't want you to function like that because that's dysfunctional,
Right,
right?
right.
Because every study you and I have ever seen says you put people under that much stress, you're actually not getting better
Results, yeah,
output.
you're worse.
You're getting worse,
Yeah.
right?
Right, you're putting them under a sense of stress, and they basically they're not well resourced. They can't even think straight. Okay, so let's
Right.
go
So
to
what kind of great customer service do people get when people don't think straight? What they get. So this is what I like to teach leaders, is what people get are errors.
That's exactly what I was going to say. What happens is a lot of errors. I'm
Of
sensing. Yeah, and
course.
a lot of
So you
redoing, 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 redoing.
get errors. So we can lower errors, we can increase our sensitivity to customers by slowing down so that we're thinking straight and we're tracking better, because the brain goes offline and then we don't have the thinking skills. And that's why self-care is so important and boundaries are so important, because it gives people that foundational level to function better.
Mm-hmm. Got it. All right, so let's do caretaker and I was thinking about the thing that you said earlier because people may not know because you said I ran a nonprofit or you've been part of a nonprofit, and my
Mhm.
husband also ran a nonprofit. And what people may not know, the audience may not know, when you run a nonprofit, you know, when you run a company, you think, okay, whatever. Like I work at Microsoft. If I don't do this, like what's going to happen? Nothing. But when you run a nonprofit, it's like I use the litmus. We used to say at Microsoft, is someone going to die? Because if not, then it's not that important. But and when you're running a nonprofit, actually, someone may die or someone,
Right.
right?
That's right.
Something bad can
Wait.
happen.
The weight of it is it is so much pressure on people. That's exactly it. It's
Yeah.
meaningful work, but at the same time, there's this sense of if you don't do it, people really aren't going to eat. There
Right.
really isn't going to be shelter.
Right. And so I was thinking about caretaking. It's very similar. So my girlfriend, who is a psychotherapist, was taking care of her father and her what is it, stepfather, who was awful to her. But she just thought he's not doing well. He needs care, and so she was doing everything all the time for him, 24/7. You know, wiping his butt, and he was really mean to her throughout the whole time. You know, like, oh, I don't like the way that you made my cereal. You know, why can't you wipe my butt this way? You know, it's just like you
Right.
suck. I've hated you my whole life. Like this was the whole, and I think she spent probably 6 months in that experience. I don't think she took a lot of breaks. So, and I think there was this kind of there's all this history with her and her father. And when you're caretaking for your parents, it's like a powder keg of stuff. So, how can you be a caretaker and still have boundaries? I mean, what are things that when you've
Right.
worked with people in this scenario, what kind of things do they need to understand?
So part of the boundary that comes up in caretaking is exactly what you said, the 24/7 nature,
Mm-hmm.
and being able to say, I can't do 24 hours, 7 days a week. I say to my therapy clients, I'm not on call in the middle of the night. Now,
Mm-hmm.
way back in the early days of my practice, I was,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I had to learn that I can't be 24/7. I'm not made 24/7. I'm a human being. My body has to clock out and sleep
Right.
uninterrupted
Right.
for me to function well. So when somebody is 24/7, we're already way outside of what's
Right.
humanly possible. And
Right.
so then we start working on who else can be on call, who else can help. And oftentimes caretakers do not think anybody can help.
Right. They don't know what so and so. They don't know what my husband wants or whatever.
Right. It's the help is never good enough. And it's
Yes.
like, you know what?
I've heard that
When
over and
we're a
over.
caretaker, we have to accept that other people can do things, but they don't have to do them as perfectly as you imagine. It doesn't have to be the best.
Mm-hmm.
It's okay to just have them be on call, and it's okay that this person is difficult to work with, but they'll give you a day off.
Right.
So caretakers need to be able to accept help. That's
Right.
part of the boundary.
I think that there is probably this because my aunt had the same thing where she was in a living home, right, where they actually have caretakers all over the place, and she still cooked meals. And I was like, "Why are you doing this?" And she said, "Because people don't know the kinds of things he likes." And I was like, "Okay," but seriously, like she was exhausted. She was stopped playing tennis. She stopped doing everything that she loved doing. But I
Exactly.
think the fear was that she felt like, "What if he dies?" On when I'm not
He
watching him.
eventually gonna die?
He's probably going to eventually die. He did die after 3 years of this.
Right. I mean, he is gonna die, right?
But
We're
there's
all
this,
gonna
I know,
die.
but there's this fear of like, what if he dies during my watch? You know, when I finally I was off playing tennis and he dies and I'm not around. I think that this is
That's
a thing.
right. That's right. And that can happen because you can't ask yourself. See, that's the thing. Our boundaries have one job. And I hope every listener takes this today from us, from this conversation. The job of your boundaries is to take care of you.
Mm.
That's it. Our boundaries are not made of spandex. They don't stretch over everybody. They can't take care of everybody. Our boundaries aren't made that way. And so when we force our boundaries to do that, to say yes, 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 everything for this other person, we end up saying no to anything that we need. And you described that so well, CJ. Your friend stopped playing tennis, stopped taking care of herself, stopped doing anything she needed. And what happened is there were no boundaries taking care of her.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm.
so her boundaries weren't allowed to do her job. Now, when we don't let our boundaries do our job, which is to take care of us, and when we care for others, we have to do it with some limitations. We have to allow others to help. We have to allow others to step in this imperfect way, and we can't ask ourselves to reach these impossible standards. We have to be able to give ourselves a little bit of a break and care for ourselves and say, I'm doing the best I can. I am stopping by. I am checking on you. I am bringing a meal. I'm doing what I can, but I also am obligated to take care of myself.
Right.
And if I abandon myself and walk out on me and just focus only on you and doing everything for you, and I've abandoned myself, the price is getting back to that compass later, tuning in, hearing your authentic yes and no, that goes away.
Mm. Yeah,
And what
much harder
happens?
to do. Yeah.
Yeah, you end up cut off from you. It's not that easy to return to because you've basically said to your soul, I'm no longer listening to you.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And your soul is like, well, if you're not listening, I'll stop talking.
Mm.
And
Mm-hmm.
when we get cut off from our soul, cut off from our wisdom, our lives become a mess.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All kinds of bad things happen because we're actually not checked into our wisdom any longer.
Yeah.
We're so focused on somebody else. So I understand being focused on others and caring for people who need us. But when we're caring for somebody else, our self-care must go up and must increase along the way. That's essential.
Okay, so here's the thing I hear. I already know what my clients would say to this. They would say, "Oh, well, but see, the thing is I want to take care of them, so I want to do that. So it helps me to take care of him because otherwise I feel guilty and shameful. So there's kind of this interdependency, right? Because they want to play tennis, but they also want to be there for their husband. So,
Absolutely. So
so
tell me who's taking care of you and can you take care of you for 15 minutes a day?
yeah, and she
What do
probably
you,
said, well, okay, I would, but then,
tennis may be too hard, but what are you willing to do for yourself?
okay. Okay. Because there is this interdependency, right? There is a part of you that actually your soul is saying, I do want, like my girlfriend who was taking care of her father in law or her stepfather, she did want, at some level, she wanted to make amends during that. So it was helping herself, even though she wasn't helping herself in some other way.
And it's also it's not so easy to move somebody from I'm just going to caretake somebody and that is what fulfills me without looking at them and going, well, what is the price that you're paying?
Mm,
And they may say, well, I've been eating terribly. I can't sleep. And I would ask that. I would say, how are you sleeping? How are you eating? How is your own like basic needs going? And are you feeling any fallout from this? Are you feeling stressed? Are you feeling tired? Because those are the price that you pay for this. And
right,
so who's taking care of that? Because
right,
you've walked away. So who's doing that?
right,
And even when we're going through very stressful, terrifying events with family members that we love and we're caring for, it's helpful to kind of tap somebody on the shoulder and say, how are you doing? And when
right.
they're saying, I'm exhausted, it's okay, well, is there a way for you to take a small break and begin to take care of how tired you are?
Mm-hmm.
Just
Mm-hmm.
taking care of that. Tennis would be way, way off
Right.
the
But like
map.
10 minutes,
But
I think is like, yeah, right.
sleeping,
Sleeping.
napping, going home, that would be good.
Right, I like that. And I like the idea. I think it's within reason to say something like 10 minutes. Just 10 minutes, and then we're okay, I can take 10 minutes. Like everyone can take 10 minutes, but it's starting to build the muscle when you're doing that. So then you talked about people. So there's two different modalities when you ignore your needs and then bury your inner self. So you talked about one, which is numbing, which, it's like drinking. For me, it's like my way of numbing is I watch way too much Netflix. Um,
That is like probably everybody's number one way to numb is Netflix. Maybe that's why it starts with an N. I have no idea, but I hear that one all the time.
really?
Netflix. Yeah.
That's one way of numbing. So that's basically there's a part of me that's trying to speak to me, and I'm like, no, no, no. I need to watch all of Orange is the New Black. I can't. I do not have time to listen to my soul.
That's right. That's right. Numbing out. And there's a certain extent that numbing does take care of us, particularly
Mhm.
if you work with a lot of people.
Mhm.
So people who work with people need a little bit of shutdown time, and people who work on computers all the time, they might want to stop problem solving and just like have the story told to them. And so I get that, there's a certain level of numbing and mindlessness that's actually good for us, gives
Mhm.
ourselves a break. And only you can tell if your numbing is going to a place where it's gone too far
Mm.
and it's
Mhm.
not really taking care of you, but people are saying to you things like, hey, can you put the phone down? We're having dinner. We never get to see you.
Mhm.
Um, and friends are saying like, I haven't seen you in months and months. Are we friends? And people are bringing to your attention that the numbing is intervening with having a relationship with you.
Right.
And that's often how people with numbing get feedback. So they get feedback from people around them that what they're
Mm.
doing is cutting everybody else off.
Mhm.
And the other is that they start to feel lonely. Like
Mm.
so if they don't have people around them, if they don't have close relationships and no one is giving them feedback, what numbers will often say is, I feel so isolated.
Mm.
And so isolated is, well, what are you doing? Well, I don't really have close friends. I haven't really had time for friendships. And a lot of women who work, I'm just going to be really honest and say a lot of us haven't had time for our nurturing our good friends.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so, you know, um, sometimes men find that there's like a little bit more of a club for them to kind of be part of with other guys. But for women, it has been very isolating into more caretaking roles
Mm-hmm.
and then working. And women tend to say back that, they haven't had time for their friends,
Mm-hmm.
really.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's kind of it takes effort to kind of step forward and look at your life and say, is there something I can do instead of numbing? And what I like people to do is do the opposite. So do things that turn on your five senses.
Mm.
So,
Oh, like eating? No, that's
yes,
not what you mean.
yes, it could be like eating really does, cooking really does.
Right.
Because it turns all your senses on, and going out for a walk on the beach turns on your senses. And so there's a lot of things that you can do that are very simple that just awaken your senses. I
Mm.
knit, so that's one of the ways that it could look like numbing because I'm just kind of checked in and knitting, but I can also knit with friends.
Mm-hmm.
And knitting to me is also gets my senses, my hands very tactile. And in
Mm.
my work, I don't really use my hands very much. So I,
Oh,
I
like
like doing
it.
that.
Oh, I like it. Okay, then there's the um, hiding that we just talked about. And then there's kind of like loving too much, or what was that? You try to give love to get love. Is that the idea?
Lovers tend to feel like they love and love and love on people, but they never feel loved in return.
Hmm.
And that pattern of that, if you find yourself in that, it's often really tied to learning how to love yourself, needing
Hmm.
needing to learn how to love you, because deep down inside, underneath the loving pattern, is often somebody who really doesn't feel good about themselves.
Hmm.
And so I always see that as a signal to, like, let's work on how you feel about you,
Hmm. Mm-hmm.
and how you care about you and what you do when your self-esteem feels and your self-worth has really taken a beating from a lot of experiences, and how do you recover from that, and where do you truly build up your self-worth, because
Hmm.
it's not going to really come from these other people on the outside.
Hmm.
Self-worth is an inside job.
Mm-hmm.
And so until lovers can really work on some of their self-worth and feeling better about themselves, then they can engage in loving relationships where they feel like they're getting more in return because they're picking better and they don't feel so empty.
Right. Well, if your coffers are full, then whether someone loves you back, it doesn't matter because you feel love regardless. I think, is that what you're saying?
Well, and you choose better
Mm.
because you tend to expect something different, and you look at people's behavior and how they're treating you, and you
Yeah.
recognize, "Ooh, this doesn't feel loving to me.
Right.
Oh, that
I
feels
see.
like rude and dismissive." You know that on like the first hour with somebody.
Yes.
Like,
Yes.
okay, you were 25 minutes late and now you're talking on your phone. No, I don't think there'll be a second date.
Right. Right.
But
Right.
these people like will hang on in relationships hoping for something better, looking for love in kind of places where people don't have that to give. But when you have filled your coffers up, you wouldn't tolerate that kind of stuff.
Right.
You would see it much quicker, and you
Right.
would be able to interact with that and say, "Oh, that
Uh,
doesn't feel loving. I don't need to keep pursuing with this person. I'm moving on." But when your self-esteem feels so low, you really think that, it's you, and that if you just hang in here long enough, it'll get better. But when your
oh,
self-esteem goes up, you realize, hey, it's not me, it's you, and I don't need this. I'm
oh my
worth more
gosh.
than
I
this.
have so many people that need to see you and would be based on that
Oh
conversation.
God, CJ, can I tell you, I don't take more
You
clients.
don't?
My practice has been full for years here. I am full. I don't write books because I'm building my practice. I write books because I can't see more people.
Ah,
So I take
okay.
workshops and books to kind of make it available to
Ah,
people.
okay.
And yeah, yeah.
Okay, so that's to figure out first what your issues are. If you're a workaholic, we've talked about the lover, we've talked about the number, we've talked about isolating, we've
Well,
talked
what
about
your people should know is in the book, under each of those categories, they're going to find exercises,
yes,
questions to help them dig themselves out.
right. Yeah.
because, like I said, I don't actually write books to build my private practice.
Right.
I know some people actually do that, but
Yeah.
that's not what I do. I'm
Right.
writing books to give you self-help
Right.
guides.
Got it.
And so those questions, although the book is very, very skinny, people have spent like a year and a half just journaling with those questions and
Wow.
digging out their boundaries.
Wow.
So do the work, do the questions under each pattern. Now go ahead.
So
You were going to cover one more.
protector
Yes.
and sacrificer. Let's talk about those two.
Okay. Um, let's boy, those are the big ones. They're all big.
Okay.
Let's talk first about the protectors. Protectors, other words that people may associate with a protector is codependent. That may be
Mm,
a word that you've heard.
mm-hmm.
But if you haven't heard that word, a protector is somebody that is covering for problems around them. So you may be living a life where you're living with an alcoholic, or somebody in your family has a gambling addiction, and maybe you've told no one.
Mm,
Protectors don't tell people what's going on in their lives.
mm.
Protectors protect the people with problems in their life.
Oh.
And so what they do is they end up in their relationships not being very authentic. And nobody
Mm.
really knows what's going on in their life. This is a
Oh.
protector is somebody who gets cancer and tells no one.
Okay, got it. I get it.
So that's a protector. A protector is I go home to this alcoholic who has spent all of our money and we're actually bankrupt, but I've told absolutely no one. So my best friends don't even know me. And
Wow.
what happens is uh, people feel hurt and betrayed by protectors
Mm.
because your friends feel like they don't know you. And
Right.
they feel like I've been telling you all my shit, excuse me, all
Right.
my crap. I've been putting all my stuff on the table, and you haven't really shared
Right.
authentically anything, like
Right.
what's going on in your life. And so protectors end up feeling alone in relationships because they're so worried that that anybody would judge the person in their life with a problem who they'll
Mm-hmm.
hang in there with. And people will say, oh, leave that person. Oh my God, they spent all your money and now you're bankrupt and you work so hard. You should just leave. Protectors don't want to hear that. And so
Mm.
they don't tell people because
Oh.
they're afraid of leaving. But what happens is protectors have to begin their healing and their recovery by first telling themselves the truth.
Mm.
First, you have to get to facing what really is going on in your life and kind of coming out of denial about
Mm-hmm.
it.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next step is you have to find one person that you can tell the truth to
Mm.
and start being authentic.
Mm.
It doesn't mean that you have to leave. It doesn't mean anything other than you have to start showing up with being who you are in your relationships so that people can connect to you so you're not so
Mm.
isolated.
Mm. Mm. I don't know very many protectors, so I can't add
Well, you
anything
see,
more
because
to.
they're hard to know because you don't know.
I don't know.
You're
I
like,
guess
that's
that's
exactly
true.
it, CJ, you got it. That's exactly it. And then,
Okay.
like years later, they tell you something, and you're like, "Oh my gosh, I had no idea."
Yeah, why
Right?
didn't you tell me? Okay, got it. And what's a
Protectors are hard.
sacrificer? What's a
So
sacrificer?
sacrificers are a little bit like caretakers and a little bit like lovers, but they're different. Sacrificers have a belief system,
Mm-hmm.
really strong belief about why they do what they do. They don't really listen to their own yes and no
Mm-hmm.
because they have a belief system that tells them what is a yes and what is a no.
Mm-hmm.
And they just follow that belief system that they were taught.
Oh, okay. So like a religious thing, like God says, blah blah blah. Follow that.
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly. God says women should obey all men, so that's what I'm doing. But on the
Oh.
inside, the sacrificer isn't really asking themselves, how's that going for you? How's that feel? Is that
Oh.
really true? Because sometimes a sacrificer is bubbling up inside, broiling with anger
Mm.
because they're trying to follow what they think they should be doing.
Mm.
But they're inside, this isn't true for them.
Mm,
And they're
mm-hmm.
in conflict often with their culture or their religion or their beliefs. Sometimes a conflict comes up and they don't know how to resolve it because the belief tells them one thing, but their inside is saying another. And they have to learn. I think therapy or coaching is really helpful for people that are sacrificers because it takes some time to kind of learn how to sort out that it's okay to be in conflict with your belief system. And
Mm,
sometimes we change our belief systems. And our conflict inside is our wisdom.
yeah, so this is reminding me of someone who is a gay man in a fundamental Christian background who is like, was told that he was evil and if he was gay, he would go to hell. So it's like, that wasn't super helpful because inside he felt he was gay. So,
That's right. That's right. And so we have a lot of those boundary conflicts where the outside of us is telling us something that our inside does not believe, but it's hard for us to bridge the two different belief systems. And
mm,
oftentimes, sacrificers will go with a belief system that they're going to sacrifice their own beliefs.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And so then they have to come back to, but what is it that you believe? Is that
mm-hmm,
really true for you? Sometimes it is true, and then you're not really sacrificing. But when you're sacrificing, you're often going with a belief. And so I always hear the word believe in their
mm,
story is I
mm,
believe such and such. And then I know the belief system is taking over the inner yes and no compass. The belief
interesting.
is more important. So you'll see this a lot with people who want to, some of our listeners are people who are staying in a marriage that they know they need to leave,
Mm-hmm,
right? They know
mm-hmm,
inside, I have to get out of this. But they believe in marriage. They
mm,
believe that they should not break this vow.
mm,
And so keeping the idea of the marriage is more important than what's really true for themselves, right? So
interesting, yes.
that's a place where they may be sacrificing and staying in a loveless marriage,
Mm,
and there is no real connection and the people are emotionally divorced, but on paper the paper means more
right.
than themselves, and so they
Totally
may be
met those people too.
sacrificing,
Yeah.
right, for the
Interesting.
marriage.
So you have these different modes that you describe in the book. And so for me, like I can relate to the workaholic and then the number. So does someone often find themselves falling in, I think you said for yourself, you fall into several different categories
Mhm.
and then in some way figuring out what mode you are in helps you, I mean literally figure out what mode you are in and listen to all the advice that you gave afterwards.
A lot of it's in the book. I mean, like the book will really
Right.
answer a lot.
Right. So you talk about figuring out what your mode is, and then you talk about
Recovering one step at a time, one mode at a
recovering.
time.
Yeah.
So if you feel like, well, I'm a workaholic, sacrificer, caretaker, which can happen, um, you work through one at a time. You
Right.
don't try to work through all of it at once because it's too overwhelming. You just pick one and then you start working on how you bring balance to that pattern. And then the things that you learn about that you apply to the next one and then you start working through there. It takes time. You have to be patient with this process of committing to yourself.
All right. So in the last couple minutes, I don't even know if it's possible, but there are
That's okay.
people. You have like people who are um, manipulate you, make you feel guilty. I have a friend who is like, "So you can't meet, and you can't. So you can't meet. Is that right? Can't you do this?" And I was like, "You know what? I think I said no already, and then you keep on asking me over and over again. Like this is what I'm thinking in my head." So I'm like, yes." I did say no, so the answer's still no. Like sometimes I'll say like the answer's still no, and
Perfect.
then the person will say, "Oh, but you know, I so much think that we should actually go to these things." I'm like, "Yep." And she's like, "Well, you've said before, blah blah blah," and I said, "I think you're trying to make me feel guilty about this, and I don't really feel like I should feel guilty. I just don't want to go." So,
So that's a learned behavior. People that push and manipulate. You know, people are always going to push against our boundaries.
Right.
Even when they love us very, very much, they're going to
Yeah.
push up against us. And it's up to us to maintain the fence line. And some people you can just say no and they're like, okay, and they're onward. And they don't need you to repeat it multiple times. And then some people will keep coming back because that's how they're used to getting what they want, and they want to decide where your boundary is.
Ah, so they're
And
trying
so
to figure out where my boundary is. So if I
correct.
say
And if
like
they can move it. They're used to moving it for people. So you have to decide, is your boundary like living room furniture? Can people come in and rearrange it for you?
right. And if
And
you do it once, guess what? They're going to come back and do it again.
exactly. So your boundaries are not living room furniture. People cannot come in and just move them around wherever they want them. And it's okay for people to push up against you because they try to do that all the time. That's human nature. But what you have to do is pay attention and say, yeah, I'm not changing my mind. Sorry, you'll need to ask somebody else.
Right. Love it.
And as many times as they need to hear that. And you can say, oh, this is the third time that you've asked me. I don't feel like I need to answer it again. I think we know the answer, right?
Oh, I like that one too, because she will ask me 3 times. And I don't
Okay,
think.
so for people that struggle with these, you won't believe this. I've made these boundary cards.
Oh, that's so
So they're
cool.
like flashcards with different boundaries, little tips to remind you what to do.
Oh,
And so
fun.
sometimes we need little tips to remind us of like, okay, this is what I do. But it does help to do just what you said. Write down little phrases that work. I write them down. I keep them by the phone. And when that person calls, I know exactly what I'm going to say because I'm just reading it because I've already practiced it. I don't have to like get stressed out
Oh,
about what
okay.
they're asking me. So always write down your boundary for the boundary pushers.
When I love the idea, can I, and I feel like I'm breaking a boundary by asking you, but can I spend
What?
one more minute asking bringing
Of
up something?
course.
Okay. So there's something in here also on, you talk about, on these challenging cases that people will say, well, are you sure? I've had so many, especially when you are in a school, they're like, can you run this whatever nonprofit, blah, 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 blah. And it would be so great if you
The
could help
PTA.
us. Yeah, exactly. I'm like, ah. But the thing is that's interesting is that part of it that you said that's so important that I love this. This was my like aha moment, which is what defining responsibilities, time, and access to say I only have Mondays. I only have this much time. If it can be done within that time, then great. But otherwise, I can't do it. Or the access, like you can give me, I'm only available on Mondays at 5 to 7, and I can only spend 2 hours. So if it's possible, then that's great. I can only be responsible for things, and then the responsibilities is I can only be responsible for these things. I cannot be responsible for those things. Oh, that was just like,
Please, if your listeners walk away with another gift from this conversation, it is define your responsibilities before you say yes to anything.
yes,
Always define your responsibilities, define how much time you can put, and define how people can reach you and how they can't. Not everybody needs to be able to call your cell phone.
right.
Not everybody needs a response if they email you within an hour.
Mm-hmm.
So you get to define what is my response time? What
Mm,
works for me? Do I have to check my phone 40,000 times a day, or can I take that burden down? And if I'm going to commit to help out with something, can I be clear about what it is, the something that I'm actually helping out to do exactly? And what it is, where that boundary is when it stops. Because then when somebody else can't do something, they call you and say, oh, could you do one more thing? Because so and so can't show up. Or so and so had a life emergency or something happened. And you really have to be careful when you're doing any kind of group activities with people to be careful about how much you're committing and what exactly you're committing to do. And it's okay to say that's all I'm able to contribute right now. Or what I say to people is, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I'm not able to do more at this time.
I need those cards. Is that on one of those cards that you're showing?
Everybody's going to love these cards. They're
Okay.
so cool.
Okay, so
So
tell us about your
they're
website if people want to buy your book.
Oh, so come to my website. My name is Sarri Gilman, so I have a website by my name, and
Mhm.
it's also you can look up transformyourboundaries.com, or you can go to SARRIGILMAN. Um, both of those will take you to my website, and there's lots of resources. Since I don't do things to build my private practice because it's built, I'm really doing these things because these are really helpful things to
Mhm.
people, and so I try to make as much available as I can and accessible as I can. So go through there. You'll see every month there is a new webinar available, and there's a card deck that you can order, and there's workshops, and like I'll be at uh, East West Books next this coming Friday and Saturday on the
Mhm.
12th and 13th, and we can dig in and do a workshop together. So join me. See you on the
Yay.
road.
Yes, thank you so much. What great information. Love it, love it, love it. Thank you. We've been talking to Sarri Gilman, Transform Your Boundaries. Thank you so much.
Great interview. Thank you, CJ. Great
Thank you.
question.
It means so much to me that you're listening to the show. Would love your support in any way by giving me comments below or to subscribe to the show or share the show with friends. Thank you again for your support. Love and blessings.